One of the largest shifts of geopolitics in the past century was the reconciliation and alliance between Britain and the United States of America. This friendship formed the backbone of what we now consider the West. The Entente, the Allies, NATO, would all see these two powers united in arms. But this alliance was not set in stone. I'm sure all Americans and Brits are aware of the rocky start these two nations had in their relations. All throughout the 1800s and even the early 1900s, both countries' interests seemed almost completely at odds, to the point war seemed to be the only option. One of these times of conflict came just after World War I. It's the 1920s, and Britain had just pacified their biggest rival, Germany, just for them to be replaced by a new one. Their former ally, the United States, had burst onto the international scene, and were looking like they could overtake Britain as the foremost power of the world. Both sides saw war as such a possibility that they actively made plans on how to wage war on one another. The Americans dubbed this plan War Plan Red. All of this begs the question, what if these former allies truly were bound for war? What if War Plan Red actually happened? Before we dive into the what if, let's get an idea as to how these two superpowers plan to wage war on one another. The American plan, dubbed War Plan Red, wasn't declassified until 1974. It assumed the British would originally have the upper hand by virtue of the Royal Navy. They also assumed the Japanese would take up arms on the side of the British due to their alliance dating back to the beginning of the century. The Americans would take a defensive stance originally as the British and Canadians invade from the north. However, they believed that they would eventually be able to turn back the invaders and repel them from American soil. The Americans would then seize several important railways and ports along the American-Canadian border, followed by a naval invasion of Halifax to prevent further British reinforcements, and finally a full invasion and pacification of Canada. The American Navy would remain in the North Atlantic to cut off the British from Canada, and wait until an opportune moment to engage the British Navy. If they were successful, they would begin to disrupt imperial shipping. The British plan was basically just to leave the Canadians to their fate. They viewed Canada as a lost cause to defend and not vital to the survival of the empire. The British viewed the American Navy as the biggest threat to their security, believing if the Americans were able to blockade the Isles, they would be forced into surrender. The plan was to engage the American fleet in the Western Atlantic. Meanwhile, British India and Australia would invade the Philippines to rob the Americans of their largest West Pacific base. Hopefully, once the American fleet was pacified, they could force the Americans into surrender. Despite the British pessimism when it came to the defense of Canada, the Canadians were not planning on going down silently. Their own plan on how to successfully wage war on the United States was developed by Lieutenant Colonel James Buster Sutherland Brown. It assumed the only chance Canada would have to defend themselves against America would be a preemptive strike as soon as it seemed war was imminent. Paratroopers would be dropped on Seattle, Spokane, and Portland. Ground infantry would then attempt to seize Niagara Falls for the vital hydroelectric power. Once the Americans began to put up significant enough resistance, the Canadians would retreat behind the border, burning bridges as they went. What would follow is a protracted defense against the larger American force. Now that we have an idea as to how these nations planned to wage war, let's get the war to happen. Coming out of World War I, there was a significant warhawk faction within the British Navy that felt it was necessary for Britain to pacify the Americans for the security of the Empire to be ensured. The first minor change to this timeline is this faction influencing and dominating the government. This leads to the British refusing to sign the Washington Naval Treaty that would limit naval armament, seeing it as an American encroachment on their sovereignty. The Anglo-Japanese alliance is then reworked to defend against the American advances in the Pacific. A new naval arms race heats up in reaction as the Americans feel encircled. A propaganda campaign runs rampant in the United States and Canada, and to a lesser extent Britain, preparing for the great struggle between the two powers. Natural rivals from the beginning, as they would say. America takes a hardline stance on British war debt to attempt to undermine them. Britain, seeing this as a potential breaking point, begins gearing up for war. In reaction, America mobilizes. The Canadian command sees their window of preemptive strike closing. Paratroopers are launched into Portland and Seattle. America declares war in reaction. Lastly, the Japanese join in on the side of the Brits, seeing this as an opportune moment to strike. And just like that, war had begun. Canadian forces could potentially be successful in their initial objectives. However, they would meet their first serious resistance around Niagara Falls, as both sides saw the region as strategically important. Depending on how far the Americans were into mobilization, I believe that it is the Americans that would be able to secure victory, by repelling the Canadians and seizing the falls in their entirety, their first major win. At the same time, Australia, India, and Japan would launch an invasion of Manila in the Philippines. The battle would be bloody and prolonged, but I believe the coalition forces could knock the Americans out of the archipelago. The Americans would fully push the Canadians off their soil by the end of the month. They would then proceed to seize the important railways and ports, and the Navy would seize Halifax. It's now the Canadian people would realize that help wasn't coming. Morale would collapse as the Americans seized Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and even Quebec. Canada would be left with no choice but to surrender. However, the populace would remain resistant to American occupation. It's now that the stage would be set for the climax of the war. Both sides would know that total victory could only come through complete naval dominance in the Atlantic, and so both fleets would begin planning for what would most likely be the largest naval battle in history up to that point. The battle would most likely take place around the island of Bermuda in the Atlantic, the doorway to the east. Let's take a look at the numbers both fleets would be working with. The primary British Atlantic fleet consisted of at least 3 carriers, 6 battle cruisers/battleships, 6 light cruisers, 16 destroyers, and 25 submarines, and would surely be backed up by the home and Mediterranean fleets. The American Atlantic fleet would consist of a single carrier, 10 battleships/battle cruisers, around 5 light cruisers, 24 destroyers, and around 23 submarines, and could be backed up by the American spotting fleet. Overall, rather evenly matched, with the Americans holding the advantage in battleships and the British holding the advantage in carriers. This would be the defining point, and from here I could see 2 scenarios playing out. The British are unable to effectively utilize their carriers due to disorganization and poor planning. The American battleships are able to sink them before they can cause any serious damage, robbing the British of their largest advantage. The British fleet is decisively crushed. The American Atlantic fleet is able to then reinforce the Pacific and defeat the Japanese Navy. What follows is something mirroring the island hopping campaign in our own timeline as the Americans seize Japanese and British holdings in the Pacific. Finally, they are able to strong-arm the Japanese into surrender, taking some Pacific islands and limiting the size of their navy. The American fleet is then able to disrupt imperial shipping all throughout the globe, cutting off the islands from the empire. This leads to several rebellions all throughout the empire in this time of weakness, which the Americans are more than happy to support. As a blockade of British shipping begins to starve out the home islands, they are forced into complete surrender. The most successful rebellions are able to secure their own independence, and the British Navy is gutted to a fraction of its former size. America had proven itself to be the new dominant superpower, and Britain had failed to defend its place in the sun. In the coming years, Canada is integrated into the United States proper, as was laid out in Warplan Red. Both nations would be hit by the Great Depression at the end of the 1920s. While America would be able to weather it, this might just be the tipping point for the British people, perhaps leading to revolution. When 1939 would come around, the Germans would sweep across Europe. However, Britain would be in no place to intervene. Without a navy to defend themselves from the Germans, they would stay out of the conflict. America would have no reason to intervene either. The Japanese would have been pacified and would never attack the Americans, dragging them into the war. Germany could build its European empire without any resistance, and without the pressure from the West, perhaps the Germans could triumph over the Soviets in their conquest. But this is becoming far too similar to a what if Germany won World War II scenario, which I've already made a video on. So that's where I'll have to leave this side of the scenario. The British used their carriers effectively and decisively to sink American battleships and secure an early advantage. The American fleet is decimated and the British secure their naval dominance. After doing the same in the Pacific, the British completely blockade American shipping, starving them out. As the British and Japanese seize more and more holdings in the Pacific, American morale would plummet, as food shortages and price hikes become more and more prevalent due to the blockade. The war would become less and less popular. Up north, the Canadians, bolstered by this news of success, would begin resisting the American occupation with even more ferocity. Finally, the Americans would give in, ceding several holdings in the Pacific and having to accept serious naval limitation, as well as canceling all British war debt. When the Great Depression would hit, it would instead be America where this could serve as a breaking point. With unrest so rampant, the American rise would be at least delayed for several decades, and Britain would have secured its hegemony. Once Germany would invade all of Europe during World War II, the British would stand against the Nazis, but this time there would be no American support. I could still imagine a successful invasion of Italy and a toppling of Mussolini from power, but I doubt the British would attempt an operation like D-Day by themselves, leaving the Soviets to do the heavy lifting all by themselves, slowly and bloodily pushing the Germans back. However, in return, all of Europe would be open to them. Poland to France would all fall under communist regimes, and Britain would stand alone against them, with potentially Italy as their only stronghold in the continent. In the end, it seems that it was ultimately the most beneficial to both nations' interests to join forces against outside threats rather than completely dominate the other. Perhaps this can be taken as a lesson, to join forces with your fellow man rather than try to get them to submit to your will. A warning against hubris, a rare instance in history where peace ultimately prevailed.
A big one too. Let's have a party, just me and you.
Oh, what an evening, and ooh, what a kiss. Say, I never thought I'd be feeling like this.
My heart's bumping, thumping, and I don't mean maybe.
I got an idea, so get ready, baby. Hey, let's have a party. Let's call the guys.
Let's have a party, we'll hit the skies.
I'll play piano, I'm not too bad.
I'll sing soprano, we'll all go mad.
I'll bring refreshments, some wonderful stuff. You bring those beautiful lips, that's enough.
Hey, here comes Tommy, now we can move. He'll have 'em jumping right in the groove.
Well, here comes Jimmy, oh, just let him in. Looks like we're ready.